The first rests in the Library of Virginia, a population register from Richmond's Shockoe Bottom district, dated March 1839. 19. The second was maintained by the county clerk's office, a tax ledger carefully listing every household and resident. The third was never meant for public view. It was a private ledger, sealed in a merchant's safe, for 47 years until his grandson discovered it wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were names that appeared nowhere else. 19 children, teen children, different ages, different families, different streets, all recorded in that third ledger as relocated on the same night, April 14th, 1839. There was no destination, no explanation, no explanation, no explanation. And in the city and county records, those same 19 names simply vanish. They are not marked deceased. They are not listed as moved. Their entries stop midline, as though the clerk had paused and never returned to complete the page. What makes this unsettling is not just the bureaucratic impossibility. It is what followed. Within 6 months, all 19 families who lived blocks apart, attended different churches, worked in unrelated trades, sold their homes, every single one. When new occupants moved in, neighbors would later recall how strangely bare the houses felt. Floors scrubbed to a pale finish, walls washed so harshly they carried the sharp scent of lye. No toys, no clothing, no forgotten belongings. Not even the ordinary debris left behind in hurried departures. The merchant who kept the third ledger was named Cornelius Webb. He traded in textiles and imported furniture, and maintained substantial contracts with institutions throughout Virginia. His bookkeeping was known for its precision. Bank deposits matched invoices, shipping manifests aligned perfectly with payments. Webb was not careless with numbers, yet beside those 19 names, his ledger bears a brief notation, collection fulfilled. No documentation required per agreement. 3 days later, a deposit of $4,200 appears in his account. That raises an unavoidable question. What type of agreement requires children to be removed without official record? In the summer of 1840, a small notice appeared in a Richmond newspaper. It requested information about several families, formerly of Shockoe Bottom, who had departed without forwarding addresses. A reward was offered. The notice was placed by a lawyer, Martin Caulfield, who court documents show represented a coalition of churches attempting to locate former congregants. The advertisement ran for 6 weeks. No one came forward. No reward was ever claimed. The families were never found. This is the account of April 14th, 1839, the night 19 children were moved without records. And it is also the story of what 3 individuals uncovered when they tried to trace where those children were taken. Richmond in 1839 was a city built on agreements, not only the written contracts filed in courthouses, but the silent understandings that shaped everyday life. Merchants and suppliers operated on trust. Landlords and tenants relied on reputation. Capital and labor were bound together by nods, handshakes, and unspoken arrangements. Many transactions required no paper trail at all, because everyone involved understood precisely what was expected. Shoe Bottom was where many of these contracts were made. The neighborhood sat in the low basin near the James River, a warren of brick towners, boarding establishments, warehouses, and workshops. It was densely populated, loudly industrial, and perpetually covered in a fine coating of coal dust from the nearby railway depot. The people who lived there were coopers and seamstresses, dock workers and larisses, clerks and craftsmen, the functional middle tier of Richmond society, not wealthy but not destitute, respectable but not prominent. The 19 children who disappeared came from this world. Their names, according to Cornelius Webb's ledger, were Thomas Reeve, age 11, Margaret Doyle, age 8, Samuel and Abigail Quinn, twins, age 10, Henry Moss, age 7, Catherine Brenner, age 9, Rebecca Watts, age 12, Joseph and Daniel Palmer, brothers, ages 8 and 6, Ellen Cross, age 11, William Archer, age 9, Sarah Lindley, age 7, Lucy H., age 10, James Rudge, age 8, Alice Porter, age 12, Peter Finch, age 9, Mary Sinclair, age 11, Hannah Brooks, age 8, and Caroline Webb, age 7, and Cornelius Webb's own daughter. That last name is where the story begins to fracture into something harder to explain. Why would a successful merchant, a man with contracts throughout the state, include his own child in a transaction he documented as a collection? Why would he record her name alongside 18 other children? Note that they were relocated without documentation and then accept payment for this service. The answer, or at least the beginning of one, came to light in February 1840, when a seamstress named Judith Reeve tried to retrieve her son's baptismal record from St. John's Episcopal Church. Thomas Reeve, age 11, had been baptized there in 1828. Judith needed the record to settle an inheritance matter. Her mother had recently passed, and the lawyer handling the estate required proof of Thomas's age and legitimacy. The church secretary, a Phidias man named Roger Pendleton, searched the baptismal registry. He found the entry, Thomas Reeve, baptized September 14th, 1828, son of Judith and William Reeve, both present and in good standing. But when Pendleton checked the church's membership rolls, the list of active congregants maintained for collection of tithes and distribution of parish aid, the Reeve family was listed only until April 1839. After that, nothing. Their names simply stopped appearing. No forwarding address, no notation of transfer to another parish. No death recorded. Judith Reeve was standing right in front of him. "I'm sorry," Pendleton said carefully, "but according to our records, your family is no longer affiliated with this parish as of April of last year." "That's ridiculous," Judith said. "We moved to Manchester." Manchester was across the river, a growing suburb of Richmond. "We attend St. Andrew's now. We informed Father Caldwell when we left." Pendleton checked the transfer records. There was no note of any Reeve family transferring their membership. He checked the correspondence files. No letter from Judith or her husband notifying the church of their move. "There must be a mistake," Judith said, but her voice had changed. Something uncertain had crept into it. Pendleton looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Mrs. Reeve, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Where is your son, Thomas?" Judith's face went pale. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because according to our records, your family ceased attending services in April of last year, and I'm looking at a notation here in Father Caldwell's handwriting that says, 'I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought this up.'" "What does it say?" Pendleton hesitated. Then he turned the registry so Judith could see. Next to the Rev family name in the April 1839 column, Father Caldwell had written in small, cramped script, "Family withdrawn. Matter closed per arrangement." Judith stared at those words. "We didn't withdraw. We moved. Father Caldwell knew we were moving." "When did you last see Father Caldwell?" "April 13th. He came to our house tea hat evening. He said he wanted to. He said there was something we needed to discuss about Thomas's education. He was very insistent that we speak privately." "And what did you discuss?" Judith's hands had started to shake. "I don't remember." That wasn't entirely true. She remembered some of it. She remembered Father Caldwell, sitting in their front parlor, his hat balanced on his knee, speaking in low, soothing tones about opportunities and obligations. She remembered her husband, William, nodding slowly, asking careful questions. She remembered feeling a strange sense of relief, as if a burden she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. And she remembered waking up the next morning to find Thomas's bed made, his clothes packed neatly in a trunk that now sat in their attic, and William telling her calmly that everything had been taken care of. "He's at a school," William had said, "a very good school. He'll receive an excellent education." "Which school?" Judith had asked. William had looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Something distant and final. "We're not to ask questions about it." That was the agreement. And the strange thing, the thing that still bothered Judith when she allowed herself to think about it, was that she had accepted this answer. Not just accepted it, but felt somehow compelled to accept it, as if the decision had been made by someone with more authority than her husband, someone whose judgment could not be questioned. She hadn't seen Thomas since April 14th, 1839. Roger Pendleton was watching her carefully. "Mrs. Reeve," he said, "you're not the first person to come here looking for records from last April. Martin Coffield first heard about the missing children in August 1839, 4 months after their disappearance. He was a young lawyer only 2 years out of his legal training with an office above a tobacco shop on Main Street. His practice consisted mainly of property disputes, contract reviews, and the occasional estate settlement. Routine work that paid modestly but steadily. He was methodical, thorough, and had a reputation for finding details that others missed. A woman named Frances Doyle came to his office on a sweltering afternoon, carrying a worn leather folder containing what she said were all the documents related to her daughter, Margaret. "I want you to find her," Frances said. Coffield, assuming this was a custody matter, asked the expected questions. Had the child been taken by the father? Was there a dispute over guardianship? No, Frances said, nothing like that. She went to a school. We were told it was a school. But when I write to the address we were given, my letters come back. When I try to visit, the building is empty." Coffield opened the folder. Inside were letters, a birth certificate, a baptismal record, and most puzzling, a receipt. The receipt was dated April 14th, 1839, and was signed by someone named Dr. Nathaniel Erskine. It acknowledged receipt of one child, female, age 8, in good health and proper condition to be placed in appropriate educational facility per agreed terms. There was no mention of which educational facility. No address, no contract specifying the terms of enrollment. "Who is Dr. Erskine?" Coffield asked. "I don't know. My husband dealt with him. My husband said this was an opportunity that Margaret would receive an education we couldn't afford to give her otherwise." "And where is your husband now?" Frances looked down at her hands. "He died 2 months after Margaret left his heart. The doctor said he was only 36 years old." Something in her tongue made Coffield look up from the documents. "You don't believe it was his heart. I believe my husband agreed to something he shouldn't have agreed to. I believe he knew it, and I believe the guilt killed him." Over the next 3 months, Coffield received 6 more visits from parents with similar stories. Always the same pattern. A visit from a respected figure, a minister, a doctor, a merchant who spoke of opportunities and obligations, a private meeting, a decision made quickly, often that same night, a child collected the next morning, usually before dawn, a receipt signed by Dr. Nathaniel Erskine, acknowledging transfer of the child to appropriate educational facilities, and then nothing. No letters from the children, no reports on their progress, no address where they could be visited, just a persistent, nagging absence that the parents seemed unable or unwilling to investigate too deeply, as if asking questions would violate some crucial term of the agreement they'd made. Coffield began to compile a list. By October 1839, he had identified 12 families who had sent children away, under similar circumstances, all on or around April 14th. By January 1840, he had found evidence of 19. That's when he discovered Cornelius Webb's name in a shipping manifest. It was a routine document, the kind lawyers review constantly in commercial disputes. Webb had been hired to transport educational materials from Richmond to an address in the Allegheny Mountains near the town of Clifton Forge. The shipment date was April 15th, 1839. The cargo was listed as books, writing materials, furniture, and sundry items for institutional use. Caulfield obtained copies of Webb's other shipping records for April 1839. There were 5 separate shipments in that month, all to the same address in Clifton Forge, all categorized as educational materials. The total weight of the cargo was substantial, over 4,000 across all 5 shipments. But what caught Caulfield's attention was a notation in Webb's personal ledger, which he obtained through a subpoena in an unrelated business dispute. The ledger showed the same shipments, but with different cargo descriptions. Where the official manifest said educational materials, Webb's private record said collection fulfilled. No documentation required per agreement, and one of the children listed in that collection was Caroline Webb, his own daughter. Caulfield went to Webb's residence on Franklin Street, a substantial brick house with a columned portico. A housekeeper answered the door and informed him that Mr. Webb was not receiving visitors. "Tell him I'm here about his daughter, Caroline." The housekeeper's expression didn't change. "Mr. Webb has no daughter, sir. He had a daughter in 1839. She was 7 years old. I've worked in this house for 12 years, sir. Mr. Webb has never had children." Caulfield left his card and walked back to his office, his mind racing. A man doesn't simply forget his own daughter, and a housekeeper of 12 years would certainly know if her employer had ever been a father, unless Caroline Webb had never existed, or unless something had happened that required everyone to agree collectively that she had never existed. The address in Clifton Forge turned out to be a mountainside facility called the Allegheny Institute for Juvenile Correction and Education. Caulfield discovered this by tracing property records. The land had been purchased in 1837 by a consortium of investors calling themselves the Virginia Educational Trust. The Trust's stated purpose was to establish modern facilities for the moral and intellectual improvement of children requiring specialized instruction. The facility itself was remote, accessible only by a narrow mountain road that wound through dense forest. It consisted of a main building, a severe 3-story structure of gray stone, and several outbuildings for workshops, storage, and staff housing. High walls surrounded the compound. The only gate was kept locked and guarded. Caulfield made the journey in March 1840, traveling by coach to Clifton Forge and then hiring a local guide to take him up the mountain road. The guide, a taciturn man named Hugh, agreed to take him to the gate, but refused to go further. "They don't like visitors up there." "They don't like visitors up there," Hugh said. "It's an educational facility. Surely they have parents who come to visit." Hugh gave him a long look. "Do they?" The gate was solid iron, 12 feet high, set into a stone wall that extended in both directions until it disappeared into the trees. A small gatehouse stood beside it. Caulfield knocked on the gatehouse door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. This time he heard movement inside, the scrape of a chair, heavy footsteps. The door opened to reveal a large man in a brown uniform, his face deeply lined, his eyes watery and remote. "No visits without appointment." The man said, "I'm an attorney. I'm here on behalf of several families who no visits without appointment." Caulfield pulled out the list of names he'd compiled. "I need to verify whether these children are enrolled here. It's a legal matter." The guard looked at the list without taking it. "Never heard of them." Then you won't mind if I speak with the director to confirm that. Director's not available. When will he be available? Don't know. They stood there facing each other across the threshold. Caulfield could see past the guard into the gatehouse interior. There was a day-scape with a large leather-bound ledger on it. A ring of keys hung on the wall, and on a shelf above the desk, barely visible, was a stack of papers that looked like receipts. "Who's the director?" Caulfield asked. Dr. Caulfield asked. "Erskine." Caulfield felt his pulse quicken. "Dr. Nathaniel Erskine." The guard's expression didn't change. "That's right. I need to speak with him. It's extremely important. Can't help you." The guard moved to close the door, but Caulfield put his hand against it. "Listen to me. 19 families have lost track of their children. They were told the children were being educated. They were given receipts signed by Dr. Erskine. They have a right to know if their children are here." The guard's face remained impassive. "Nobody here by those names." He pushed the door closed with enough force that Caulfield had to step back or risk his fingers being crushed. Caulfield stood outside the gate for a long time, looking up at the main building visible beyond the wall. It was a grey, cheerless structure with narrow windows. He couldn't see any movement inside. No children playing in the yard, no staff going about their duties. The entire place felt abandoned, despite the evidence that someone was living in the gatehouse. As he turned to walk back down the mountain road to where Hugh was waiting with the coach, Caulfield heard something that made him stop. A child's voice, high and thin, carrying across the distance. It was singing, or not quite singing, more like reciting in a rhythmic chant. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. Mechanical, emotionless, rehearsed. It came from somewhere inside the compound, echoed off the stone walls, and then stopped abruptly, as if cut off mid-word. Caulfield waited, listening. He heard nothing else, just the wind in the pines and the distant rush of a stream somewhere down the mountain. When he got back to the coach, Hugh was smoking a pipe and watching the sky. "You learn anything?" "No," Caulfield said, "but I'm going to." Back in Richmond, Caulfield began to research the Virginia Educational Trust. The trust had been established in 1836, with capital from several prominent Richmond families. The articles of incorporation stated its purpose was to provide educational and correctional services for children of families, requiring such services with particular attention to moral instruction and practical training. The language was vague enough to apply to almost any kind of institution. It could mean a boarding school for children of wealthy families who wanted their offspring educated away from home. It could mean a reformatory for juvenile delinquents. It could mean an asylum for children with mental or physical disabilities. What made the trust unusual was its funding structure. Rather than charging tuition directly to families, it operated on a subscription model. Wealthy patrons contributed annual funds to support the trust's operations. In exchange, they received the authority to nominate children for placement in the trust's facilities. This meant that poor families like the Doyles and the Reeves, could have their children accepted into the trust's programs without paying tuition. All that was required was a nomination from a patron and the family's consent. Caulfield obtained a copy of the trust's subscriber list. It was a who's who of Richmond society: merchants, bankers, physicians, clergy, politicians. Many of them were members of the same exclusive clubs, attended the same churches, sat on the boards of the same charitable organizations, and several of them, Caulfield discovered, had been present at a Forters meeting in March 1839, 1 month before the 19 children disappeared. The meeting had been held at the Exchange Hotel in a private dining room. It was organized by Dr. Nathaniel Erskine, who had traveled from Clifton Forge specifically to address the trust subscribers. The hotel's record showed that Erskine had reserved the room for 4 hours and had ordered dinner for 23 guests. Caulfield couldn't find any minutes or notes from that meeting, but he did find something else, a letter from one of the attendees, a banker named Gerard Stone, written to a business associate in Philadelphia. The letter was dated March 28, 1839, and had been preserved in Stone's business correspondence.
Stand, Pier, and 9.
Most of it dealt with routine financial matters, but near the end, Stone had added a paragraph that seemed oddly placed. I attended a most interesting presentation last week regarding modern educational methods. Dr. Erskine makes a compelling case for the benefits of removing certain children from inadequate home environments and placing them in controlled settings where their moral and intellectual development can be properly guided. The experiment he proposes is ambitious, but I believe it has merit. Several of us have agreed to assist in identifying suitable candidates. Caulfield read that phrase over and over. There was something clinical about it, something that reduced children to specimens in an experiment, and the word removing bothered him, not enrolling or placing, but removing, as if the children were objects to be extracted from one location and inserted into another. He made a list of everyone who had attended that meeting. Then he cross-referenced the list with the families of the 19 missing children. Every single family had been visited by someone who attended T-Hat meeting. The Doys had been visited by Father Caldwell, who was on the list. The Reeves had also been visited by Father Caldwell. The Quinn family had been visited by Dr. Caldwell. The Quinn family had been visited by Dr. Deintrus, Marcus Wells, a physician who sat on the Trust's board. The Brenner family had been visited by Gerard Stone himself, who had offered to help with a debt problem in exchange for their cooperation with an educational opportunity. Cornelius Webb, who had transported the children and whose own daughter was among them, had attended the meeting. This wasn't a series of individual decisions made by independent families. This was a coordinated operation. The attendees of that March meeting had divided up Shockoe Bottom like territory to be canvassed, systematically visiting families, making their presentations, securing consent. But consent to what exactly? Caulfield went back to the receipts signed by Dr. Erskine. He examined them carefully, looking for any clue he might have missed. The language on each receipt was nearly identical, acknowledging receipt of one child, age, gender, in good health and proper condition, to be placed in appropriate educational facility per agreed terms. The phrase "in good health and proper condition" struck him as odd. It was language typically used for livestock or goods being transferred for inspection or sale. It implied that the child's physical state had been assessed and approved prior to transfer. Why would that assessment be necessary for enrollment in an educational institution unless the institution wasn't primarily educational? Unless the appropriate facility referred to something else entirely, something that required children to meet specific physical criteria? Caulfield remembered the chanting voice he'd heard at the Allegheny Institute. The mechanical, rehearsed quality fit. He remembered the guard's flat denial that any of the named children were present, despite the overwhelming evidence that they had been transported there, and he remembered something Judith Reeve had said during their conversation. "We're not to ask questions about it." That was the agreement. What kind of agreement requires parents not to ask questions about their own children? An agreement made under duress, perhaps, or an agreement made by people who had been convinced that asking questions would violate sacred trust, or an agreement made by people who knew on some level exactly what they were consenting to and who found it easier to suppress that knowledge than to face it directly. Caulfield returned to Clifton Forge in April 1840, exactly 1 year after the children had been taken. This time, he didn't go alone. He brought with him Francis Doyle, Judith Reeve, and a Richmond City constable named Thomas Garrett, who had agreed to accompany them in an unofficial capacity. Garrett was a practical man, skeptical of conspiracy theories, but he'd known several of the missing children personally, and their disappearance troubled him. They arrived at the Institute's gate on a cold, overcast afternoon. The same guard was on duty, and he gave them the same response. No visitors without an appointment. Garrett stepped forward, showing his badge. I'm not requesting a visit. I'm conducting an investigation into the whereabouts of 19 children whose families have filed inquiries with the Richmond City authorities. I have legal authority to inspect the premises if necessary. The guard looked at the badge with no visible reaction. You're outside Richmond's jurisdiction. I'm aware of that, but I'm also authorized to pursue investigations beyond city limits when circumstances warrant. You can either cooperate and allow us to speak with Dr. Erskine, or I can return with a county sheriff and a court order. Your choice. Then he turned and walked back into the gatehouse. They heard him speaking to someone, presumably through a speaking tube or some kind of internal communication system, and then he returned. Director will see you. Wait here. 10 minutes later the gate opened, and a man in a dark suit appeared. He was tall, thin, with silver hair and a neat beard. His eyes were pale blue, intelligent and cold. I'm Dr. Erskine, and cold. I'm Dr. Erskine! I understand you have questions about some children. Cofield handed him the list of names. Erskine glanced at it briefly, then handed it back. These children are not enrolled here. Then where are they? Francis Doyle's voice was shaking. You signed receipts for them. You took my daughter. I signed receipts acknowledging that I had been consulted regarding educational placements for certain children. That's not the same as taking custody of them. My role was to assess the children and recommend appropriate facilities. The actual placements were handled by other parties. Which parties? Cofield asked. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of confidential educational placements. You're at liberty, Garrett said flatly. Or you can discuss it with a judge. Erskine's expression didn't change. I have done nothing illegal. Constable. The Virginia Educational Trust operates under a charter granted by the state legislature. Our procedures have been reviewed and approved by competent legal authorities. The families in question consented to the placements. If they now regret that consent, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't constitute grounds for legal action against the trust or its officers. We just want to know where the children are. Judith Reeves said, that's all. Just tell us where they are, and we'll leave. For the first time, something flickered in Erskine's eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but something like acknowledgement. Mrs. Revere, I understand your concern, but you need to understand something in return. When you agreed to place your son in our care, you agreed to certain terms. One of those terms was that you would not attempt to contact him or inquire about his progress for a period of no less than 5 years. That term exists for a reason. It protects the child from disruption during a critical period of development. 5 years. Judith's face had gone white. Nobody told me it would be 5 years. It was in the agreement you signed. I didn't sign anything. My husband signed it. And she stopped, unable to continue. Cofield spoke up. Dr. Erskine, several of the fathers who signed those agreements have died. Several of the mothers claim they weren't informed of the full terms, and none of them have received any communication from their children in a year. Surely you can understand why they're concerned. The terms are clear. The children are receiving excellent care and instruction. They are healthy, properly fed, and making satisfactory progress. That's all the information I'm authorized to provide. We want to see them, Francis said. I want to see Margaret. I want to know she's all right. That's not possible. Why not? Because it would violate the terms of the agreement and potentially compromise the educational process. Garrett had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. This is absurd. These are children, not prisoners. Their parents have a right to see them. No, Constable, they don't. Not when they've signed legal documents transferring educational custody to a chartered institution. If you doubt the legality of those documents, I invite you to consult with any attorney familiar with trust law. You'll find that everything we've done is entirely within our rights. Cofield felt a sick certainty settling in his stomach. Erskine was right. He'd reviewed enough legal documents to know that parents could in fact sign away substantial rights over their children, particularly in cases involving education or correction. If the agreements these families had signed were properly worded, and he had no doubt that the parents might have no legal recourse at all. "Can you at least tell us," Caulfield said carefully, "whether the children are here at this facility?" Erskine smiled for the first time, and it was a terrible smile. "No, Mr. Caulfield, the children are not at this facility. This is an administrative center. The actual educational work takes place elsewhere." "Where?" "I'm not at liberty to say then." "What is this place? Why are you here if the children aren't?" "This facility serves as a coordination center for our various educational programs throughout the region. We maintain records, train staff, and process the administrative requirements of our work. The children themselves are housed at separate locations, better suited to their needs." "Vocations," Caulfield repeated, plural. "Yes, we operate several specialized facilities, depending on the particular requirements of each case. Some children need more structured environments than others. Some require medical supervision. Some are ready for vocational training. We place each child in the setting most appropriate to their circumstances. And who decides what's appropriate?" "I do, Mr. Caulfield. That's my role. I'm a physician specializing in disorders of childhood development and behavior. I have spent 20 years studying the most effective methods for correcting deficiencies in moral and intellectual formation. The Trust hired me specifically for my expertise in this area." Francis Doyle had been listening to this with growing horror. "My daughter doesn't have any deficiencies. There's nothing wrong with her." Erskine turned his cold gaze on her. "Mrs. Doyle, your daughter was 8 years old and could barely read. She had never been inside a schoolroom. She spent her days helping you with laundry work, breathing in soap fumes, carrying water, ruining her hands with lye. In 10 years, she would have been an illiterate washerwoman, just like you, trapped in poverty, likely to die young of lung disease or childbirth complications. Now she's receiving an education that will allow her to become a productive member of society. You should be grateful." Frances opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Judith Reeve put an arm around her shoulders. Garrett stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "You sanctimonious constable," Erskine interrupted. "I'm going to give you some advice. Go back to Richmond. Tell these families that their children are being properly cared for. Tell them that in 4 more years, when the initial placement period ends, they'll have the opportunity to reunite with their children if that's deemed appropriate. And tell them that if they persist in making unfounded accusations and interfering with a legally chartered educational institution, they may find themselves facing legal consequences." He turned and walked back through the gate. It clanged shut behind him with a sound like a cell door closing. 3 days after returning from Clifton Forge, Caulfield received an unsigned letter. It was delivered to his office by a young messenger who claimed no tea to know who had given it to him. The letter was brief. "If you want to understand what happened to the children, look at the death records for Richmond and surrounding counties. Look at the years 1831, 1837. Look for children aged 5-12. Count them." Caulfield spent the next week in the county clerk's offices reviewing mortality records. What he found was disturbing. Between 1831 and 1837, Richmond had experienced an unusual number of child deaths, far more than would be expected for a city of its size. The causes listed on the death certificates varied: fever, consumption, accident, drowning, unknown illness, but the number was striking. In some months, 5 or 6 children died. In others, 10 or more. The pattern intensified in 1836 and 1837. In those 2 years alone, over 200 children between the ages of 5 and 12 had died in Richmond and the surrounding counties. 200 children. That was significantly higher than the historical average for the region, and what made it more suspicious was that most of these deaths occurred during months when epidemic disease was not prevalent. There had been no cholera outbreak during this period, no scarlet fever epidemic, no widespread influenza, yet children were dying at rates that suggested some kind of systemic crisis. Caulfield made a list of the deceased children's families. Then he cross-referenced that list with property records, tax assessments, and church registries. A pattern emerged. Most of the deceased children came from poor or working-class families. Very few came from wealthy households, and a significant number of the families had left Richmond shortly after the child's death, sold their homes, moved to other cities, disappeared from the public record. It reminded him of the families whose children had been relocated in April 1839. He took his findings to Roger Pendleton, the church secretary, who had first shown him the notation in St. John's registry. Pendleton listened carefully, his face growing progressively paler. "You think the deaths were connected to this educational trust?" "I don't know," Caulfield said, "but I think someone was experimenting, testing something, and I think a lot of children died during those tests. Then, in 1839, they refined whatever they were doing. That's when they moved from trial runs to systematic collection. Collection of what? For what purpose? I don't know. But Dr. Erskine is a physician specializing in childhood development. He talked about correcting deficiencies and appropriate settings for different children. What if he's been trying to develop methods for, I don't know, for reshaping children's behavior, for training them to be obedient, compliant, useful? Pendleton looked skeptical. That's what schools are supposed to do. Not like this. Schools don't require parents to sign away all contact for 5 years. Schools don't operate in complete secrecy. And schools don't accept payment from wealthy patrons in exchange for filling their classrooms with poor children. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the Virginia Educational Trust isn't an educational institution at all. It's something else. Something that requires a steady supply of children from families who won't ask too many questions. Like what? Caulfield didn't answer. He didn't have an answer, but he kept thinking about that chanting voice he'd heard at the Allegheny Institute. The mechanical, emotionless quality of it, like a wind-up toy performing a rehearsed routine, like something that had been programmed. On June 3rd, 1840, the Allegheny Institute for Juvenile Correction and Education burned to tea. He ground. The fire started in the middle of the night. By the time local residents saw the flames and organized a response, the main building was fully engulfed. The volunteer fire brigade from Clifton Forge made the journey up the mountain road, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing left to save. The official report stated that the fire had likely started in the kitchen, possibly from an unattended stove. The flames had spread quickly through the old wooden interior structure. All staff had evacuated safely. There had been, according to Dr. Erskine's statement to authorities, no children present at the facility at the time of the fire. Caulfield learned about the fire from a newspaper report. He immediately traveled to Clifton Forge and rode up to the site. The ruins were still smoldering. The stone walls of the main building remained standing, but everything inside had been consumed. The roof had collapsed and the upper floors had fallen into the ground floor, creating a massive pile of charred timber and rubble. Dr. Dumbarton's Erskine was there supervising the removal of documents from a fireproof safe that had survived the blaze. He saw Caulfield approaching and walked over to meet him. "Mr. Caulfield, I suppose I should have expected you. Were there any children here?" I already told the authorities no. This was an administrative facility. The children are housed elsewhere. Where elsewhere? That remains confidential. Cofield looked at the ruins. Convenient timing for a fire, Dr. Erskine. Just as questions were being asked about your operations. Are you suggesting I burn down my own facility? I'm suggesting it's a very effective way to destroy records. Erskine smiled coldly. The important records are in the safe, Mr. Safe, Mr. Safe, Mr. Safe, Cofield. And they'll show exactly what I've been telling you all along. The children were placed in appropriate educational settings with full consent of their families. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Then show me the documents. I will. When you return with a proper court order, signed by a judge with jurisdiction in this county. Until then, you're trespassing on private property, and I'm asking you to leave. Cofield turned to go, then stopped. Dr. Erskine, where's your daughter? Caroline. She was 7 years old in 1839. According to your own ledger, she was part of the collection in April of that year. Where is she now? For the first time, Erskine's composure cracked. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or something harder to name. Caroline is dead, Mr. Spear Cofield. She died of pneumonia in the winter of 1838, 6 months before the placements occurred. I kept her name in my personal records because I couldn't bear to remove it, that's all. The ledger lists her as relocated on April 14th, 1839. The ledger is wrong, or I made an error. I was grieving. Cofield studied his face. I don't believe you. Erskine stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It doesn't matter what you believe, Mr. Cofield. It matters what you can prove. And you can't prove anything. The children are alive and well. They're receiving excellent care. Their families consented to their placement, and in 4 more years, some of them may even be allowed to return home. But only if they've been successfully reformed, only if they've learned to be obedient, useful, properly civilized. That was always the point. Civilized for what? Erskine's smile began. That terrible smile. For service, Mr. Stair, Cofield. For a life of useful service to those better equipped to guide them. These children came from families who see, hold and care for them properly. We're giving them structure, discipline, purpose. We're making them into something better than they would have been. You're making them into something better than they would have been. You're making them into slaves. No, slavery is illegal in most of the North. What we're creating is something more refined, something more subtle. Call it permanent gratitude, permanent obligation. These children will spend their lives working for the families who funded their education, who saved them from poverty and ignorance. And they'll do it willingly because they'll have been trained to believe it's the natural order of things. Cofield felt sick. That's monstrous. That's progress, Mr. Cofield. That's the future of labor in this country. Not chat slavery, which is messy and morally problematic, but voluntary servitude created through careful psychological conditioning during childhood. In 20 years, the model we're developing will be adopted throughout the nation. You'll see. I'll stop you. No, you won't, because you can't prove any of this. And even if you could, who would care? These are poor children, Mr. Cofield. Unwanted children. Their parents signed them away willingly. Nobody will mourn their transformation into productive members of society. Erskine turned and walked back toward the ruins, leaving Cofield standing alone in the mountain clearing. Cofield tried. He filed complaints with the county authorities. He wrote letters to newspapers. He contacted clergy, politicians, anyone who might have influence or moral authority. Nothing happened. The Virginia Educational Trust had powerful backers, men who sat in the state legislature, who controlled banks and businesses, who could make problems disappear with a word. The articles Caulfield submitted to newspapers were declined for publication. The officials he contacted expressed polite concern, but took no action. The Attorney General's office sent him a formal letter stating that after review, they had found no evidence of wrongdoing by the Trust or Dr. Erskine. The families of the missing children fell silent one by one. Some moved away from Richmond. Judith Riev died in March 1841, the official cause listed as pneumonia. Neighbors, however, murmured that grief had hollowed her out long before illness did. Frances Doyle remarried and relocated to Charleston. When Caulfield attempted to reach her there, his letters were returned unopened, the seals unbroken. By 1842, Caulfield's law practice had collapsed. He had pressed too hard, asked questions that powerful men did not wish to hear. Clients drifted away. Associations dissolved. Eventually, he accepted a modest position as a clerk in a shipping office, recording cargo manifests and invoices, living quietly and without notice. But he did not forget. In 1847, during a work trip to Philadelphia, something brought him to a sudden halt in the middle of a crowded street. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, walked a few steps behind a well-dressed couple. Her clothes were plain but tidy, the attire of a domestic servant. She carried a basket filled with purchases. Her head was slightly bowed. Her expression was distant. Her face was Margaret Doyle's. Caulfield followed them for 3 blocks, pulse racing. When the couple paused outside a shop, he approached her carefully. Margaret Doyle. She looked at him without recognition. "I'm sorry, sir. You're mistaken. Your mother was Frances Doyle. You lived in Shockoe Bottom in Richmond. You were taken in 1839. For the briefest moment, something passed across her face. Not recognition, but fear. "I don't know what you mean, Ain. Please leave me alone." The couple stepped back onto the street. The man regarded Caulfield coldly. "Is this man troubling you, Mary?" "No, sir," she replied evenly. "He's confused." Mary, not Margaret. Caulfield stood and watched them disappear into the flow of the city. She never once looked back. He never located the other children. He never obtained proof of where they had been sent or what had been done. But over the years, stories reached him, quiet rumors of young servants who were unusually compliant, eerily detached, as though something essential had been carefully stripped away. He kept a file hidden in his desk drawer, names, copied receipts, fragments of records salvaged from ledgers and newspapers. He could not use them in court. He could not prove wrongdoing. But he preserved them because someone had to remember. Someone had to know that on April 14, 1830, 19 children were removed without record, separated from their families, their identities, and the futures that once belonged to them. They were absorbed into a system that had perfected the practice of dismantling childhood and reconstructing it into obedience, reshaping young lives into something compliant, useful, outwardly whole, yet trained to relinquish the very qualities that made them free. The Virginia Educational Trust continued its operations until 1851.